A lot to pack in today. The Milky Way, Mount Saint Helens, On1 Photo Raw, and Lume Cube's awesome new mini panel light. Well, hey everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for watching this Approaching the Scene. And I want to thank the entire community for liking, for sharing these videos, for subscribing, and for contributing what it is that you're interested in talking about, whether it's related to photography, videography, time-lapse, anything visual storytelling, in the YouTube comments, in the emails that you send me, when you're signing up for the free interactive office hours that I've been doing on Tuesday mornings throughout this lockdown. And if you want to sign up for those, I'm actually filming this after running a really fun one on camera support with a great group of people. They're free. You just go to hudsonhenry.com/office hours. And next week, we're going to be accepting images from you. There's an image challenge, and we'll go through some of those images. You can learn more about it at the sign-up site. But I just want to thank everyone for being such a contributing part of this Approaching the Scene series. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I really invite you to. That link is in the bottom right corner. Whenever you're watching, that little logo will link you in to subscribe. All right, so this week we're going to talk about Mount Saint Helens. We're going to talk about the Milky Way, On1 software. There's actually a training course that I did for On1 last year on location on Mount Saint Helens to photograph the Milky Way and edit those images and talk about capture and about edit. And normally that's locked behind a paywall in the On1 Plus photographic community that I coach in every month. But because of the 40th year anniversary of the Mount Saint Helens eruption and all the interest that's been piqued in it, they've opened that up, made it free. And so I'm gonna excerpt from it. I'm gonna give you the whole field portion and a little edited excerpt from the post-production bit, because I know a lot of people are curious about On1 software. They hear me talk about it. They've never used it or seen it. And so this will give you a little taste of what's possible in it. And I'll give you a link to go watch the entire thing. I'll give you about half of this training video because it's over an hour long. So I'll give you kind of the fun nuts and bolts stuff that was shot on Mount Saint Helens, which, you know, it's amazing. I can't believe it's been 40 years. I actually remember it as a child. I remember it dumping an inch of ash on the ground here in the Willamette Valley. And I remember my grandmother being so excited to drive up into the red zone as soon as they opened it up. She whisked me into the car, and we drove up there, and there were still burned out cars, and all the trees were knocked down in one direction, and everything was buried in ash, and snowplows had moved the ash to get up there. And it's a real seminal event here in the Northwest, and I think people all over the world remember it. But anyway, so that all's coming. But first, I want to introduce something really cool that I've had the pleasure and honor to kind of test and play with before its release today, actually. It just came out. It's Lume Cube's new mini panel, and it packs an incredible amount of power into something the size of a pack of gum that you could just easily slip in your shorts pocket. It's got a rechargeable battery, and it goes, you can change its output from 1% to 100%. At 1%, it says I have 16 hours of power. At 100%, I have 90 minutes of power, and I can really easily change the color temperature of it from really warm, like I have it right now, to cold, cold daylight, like I have it there. So a really powerful little tool. I love these things for adding continuous light into your scene. I actually just did a video for On1, a training video on photographing food, and I used nothing but these Lume Cube products to do it. I've been a big fan for a long time of their larger panel light. It's got a little more output, a huge battery, and these things hold their juice when you charge them up. A great output that's wonderful in video or stills. And then I've been even longer using the Lume Cubes. This is a Lume Cube 2, and the fact that you can add these little light modifiers to it, they can't control what color temperature they are, but you can put little gels in front of them, and you can snoot them, and you can put these kinds of diffusers on them. They all come with little cold shoe adapters that you can mount them on your camera or a light stand. Both the mini and the big panel come with nice little diffusers that make them even more nice and even. And I've been playing around with, mounting these up on these little tiniest of tiny Joby Gorilla Pods. And I'm going to have links to all this stuff in the video description. If you click the video title and scroll down on mobile or just show more when you're on the computer. You'll see all the links both to sign up for my office hours and for my gear, and also links to different parts of this video if you want to skip straight to Mount St. Helens. But setting one of these up, maybe when you're doing a Zoom meeting, turning it on and just kind of adjusting the brightness and color temperature to taste while you're chatting on FaceTime or Zoom or Hangouts or Skype, it can really add a nice light, particularly if you set it up off to the side like this. So I don't go anywhere without some of these in the bag, and I've used the bigger panel to light Delicate Arch at night during the Milky Way. It just throws out such a nice, soft, even light from these panels. I can't recommend them more highly. And if you use the links, I love Lume Cube stuff so much, I agreed to become an ambassador for them, and so if you use my links, it helps me out a little bit. So I'm putting those links in the description as well as on my ATS gear page. So with that said, again, I love the size of this thing. I'm going to jump into the Milky Way video that I talked about. I'll show you the field production part and a couple little excerpts from the post-processing in ON1's Photo Raw, and I hope you really enjoy. I'll check back in at the very end. All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about how to shoot the Milky Way. And we're going to cover everything from scouting and finding the right spot to capture the Milky Way, like here at Mount St. Helens, down to support equipment, gear that you want to consider. We'll even get into some fancy stuff like a star guide, or just touch on how you might think about using that in your workflow. And then we're going to go in, talk about exposure and finding focus in those dark situations. A little complicated. We'll talk just a touch about light painting too. And then we're going to do some start to finish Milky Way edits in Photo Raw 2019.6. So I think the most important thing about capturing a good image of the Milky Way is really doing your homework before you ever get to a location, and then when you're at that location, and making sure you have plenty of time to do it. So, I'm out here at Mount St. Helens on the north side of it. When it erupted, it blew out the north side. And I've picked a day to come out here where there's a new moon. The moon has a lot to do with capturing good Milky Way images or not. If the moon is in the sky, you're not going to have a dark enough sky to capture Milky Way. So you're looking for a period where there's no moon and the sun is completely set and there's no light. And you can scout that kind of thing in advance. I love an app on my smartphone called Sun Surveyor, and if you go into its ephemeris settings and you choose the date and the location where you're going to be, you can look at the Milky Way and it'll tell you what time it's going to be visible starting and at what azimuth on the compass bearing it's going to be at the galactic core. Another thing is seasonal. So those of us that live in the northern hemisphere, you can really only get great Milky Way shots with that galactic core where we're looking into the middle of the galaxy in the summer. It starts out happening really early in the morning in spring before dawn, and it ends right now. It's late August here in the Pacific Northwest, starting to get to the tail end of the Milky Way season. So there's only going to be a couple of hours of visibility as it sets in the evening. As the sun goes down and it goes completely black, you have the Milky Way until it rolls out of sight. In the winter in the northern hemisphere, we're looking away from the Milky Way at night, the way the Earth is turned as it's revolving around the sun. And the southern hemisphere looks at it during the night. So in the southern hemisphere, you're going to want to photograph it in winter. So I think that getting out in your computer, figuring out, what angle you can pull up your Sun Surveyor app and figure out where's the Milky Way going to be at the beginning of visibility and at the end of visibility. How's it moving through the sky? What compass bearing? And then you go on Google Maps and you think about your location. I know that the sun is setting around 7, like in a couple of hours here, and once it goes completely dark at about 10 p.m., when there's no vestige of that sunlight left, the Milky Way is gonna come into visibility almost perfectly due south, like 181 degrees. And that is right behind me, right over the mountaintop. It's gonna be low, it's gonna be right over the mountain, and it's gonna slowly revolve towards the west and set. So, having that kind of detailed information about where it's going to be in the sky at what time is just critical if you want to capture Milky Way photos. Then the second thing is to get out on the location early enough. I've been here with my good friend Nathan from On One Plus, roving around looking for interesting foreground subjects. Now there's a bit of breeze today. You can see the wind's blowing my hair right now. So any flowers or something in the foreground, unless that wind dies at sunset, which sometimes happens, is probably going to be impossible. So I'm looking more for stumps, logs, things like that. Of course, if the worst comes to worst and the mountain's really the only thing that I have for a foreground, it isn't a bad one. All right, so let's talk about the gear that you want to use to capture Milky Way images for a second. And I want to focus in on support equipment, the camera body, lens, a little bit about filtration, and we'll talk about some light painting accessories that you might want to consider, or just some things to have with you. So first of all, rock solid tripod. This is the moment where your ultralight travel pod is going to frustrate you to no end. It's just not going to hold your camera steady enough. It's not going to work if the wind comes up in the slightest. It's going to be difficult to get your composition, and you really need rock solid stability. We're talking about making 30-second or sometimes even longer exposures. And anybody who follows me knows that I'm a fluid head junkie. I just can't stand ball heads. After having used fluid heads for a while, I like the way that they balance my whole system and just let me move around as if I were on a gimbal without any flop, and easily set up and stay level no matter what. They're also really rock solid, and a good rock solid set of legs. If you have a tripod with a center column, leave that center column down if at all possible, because the center column just introduces a weakness point. The strength is all where these legs come together. That's where you want your camera supported at. So some things to think about there. Camera body. You're going to want a camera body that performs well at high ISO, that doesn't have that much noise. Newer bodies are just inherently better than older bodies. The best camera I've used in low light so far is the Nikon Z6. And I know that some of the Sony A7 III is also really good in low light. It's basically the same sensor, different sauce. Nikon has different specs than Sony. There's other great cameras out there, but do a little bit of research and do some testing yourself. See how you like images at 3200, 6400 ISO. I've even been happy with images at 20,800 ISO with my Nikon Z6. The Z7 is nowhere near as good. It has many, many more megapixels, but by squeezing more megapixels into that same sensor space, you wind up creating more noise. It's just a simple thing. The more megapixels, sometimes the more noise. The camera companies are getting better and better with each iteration of sensor. So, know what camera body and how well it performs in low light, high ISO situations. Similarly with lenses, I really prefer a prime lens, and I want a wide angle lens. The other thing about bodies and lenses is full frame is going to be better for you. And we're going to talk about it in a second when we get to exposure, about how there's a 500 rule for how long an exposure you can make with a certain focal length, and that's going to be sensor size dependent. So full frame sensor is going to help you out with doing longer exposures and not having the stars smear. I'll explain that in a minute in the next section of the video. So, my favorite lens for doing Milky Way work at this moment is a Rokinon 14mm f2.4 lens that's made for Nikon F mount. I'm using an FTZ adapter to adapt it to the Z6 or Z7. I know that Sigma is making a spectacular 14mm f1.8. It's heavy, it's expensive, but it's supposed to be one of the best lenses out there. Zeiss has a 14mm or 15mm Distagon that's phenomenal, and there's a newer version of that too. There's expensive lenses out there. The Rokinon does a great job, and it really doesn't have something that a lot of lenses have that's called coma, and that's a thing that happens where there's a chromatic aberration in the corners of the image that sort of make pinpoint light sources smear and turn into little things that can look like birds. I have a Nikon 20mm 1.8 lens that I absolutely adore, but if I shoot it at anything under 2.8 or 3.5, I get these little bird-like wings for stars in the corners, so it really doesn't work wide open. And that just attests to one of the things that I try to hit over and over in my coaching
and photography training is that, knowing your gear is far more important than buying new gear. Working with the gear that you have and knowing where it performs well and where it doesn't perform well is going to get you better images every time than buying that new piece of gear and chasing after getting better photography. Just knowing your gear. So, in my case, I love this Rokinon 14 millimeter f2.4 for Milky Way work just because of its lack of chromatic aberration and coma, and because it does such a good job in low light, and it's a beautiful lens. All right, so let's talk a little bit about filtration. All right, you clearly don't want any neutral density on. You don't want to be slowing the amount of light or limiting the amount of light coming into your lens. We're doing everything we can to get as much light in as possible. Hence, the full frame ultra wide angle lens, a camera with good high ISO. One filter you might consider, though, I use a Hoya version. There are some others out there. I really love Hoya's quality. Is the color intensifying filter. It's not a particularly expensive filter. I can't use it on this lens, but sometimes when I'm using my 20 millimeter lens from Nikon that has it has a ring on it, um, it's it's designed actually originally, the kind of glass that it is to protect welder's eyes from the arc, and then they figured out that that same kind of glass formatted slightly differently would pop fall colors and make them super saturated, so you get that kind of like overdone fall color look. And then people went out and realized, one of the things that it cuts is the kind of green and orange tone that comes from city lights, from particularly sodium vapor lights out in the city. And so what it helps do is get rid of some of that noise pollution that you get a lot when you're out photographing Milky Way. You'll get that kind of mucky orange or green. Really common is that kind of greenish glow along the horizon. This can help a lot with that. Doesn't really rob you of any light, not terribly expensive. Like all my filters, I get it in 82 millimeters, and then I use filter thread adapters to get to smaller size lenses like 77 or 58 or whatever you have. So that's a good filter to keep in mind. The other thing you always want to have when you're out photographing stars is a good headlamp. I really like these Princeton Tech Viz headlamps, and there's two reasons. One, if I triple click the button, it locks it out so that you have to triple click it again to use it at all, and that way I don't accidentally drain my batteries. The other reason is that a single click turns on a red light. Single click turns off the red light. You actually have to long press to get to a white light. And it has a soft white light for reading and then a really bright white light for route finding. They're made for mountaineering, really. I love the red light feature and how you don't have to get a white light and blow your night vision once you've kind of spent all the time out here with your eyes adjusting to the darkness for Milky Way shooting. That red light won't blow your night vision. You'll still see the scene. But you want to be able to use it if you have a close foreground subject that you want to be able to focus. We'll talk about focus in a minute, but it'll let you light up the foreground with that bright light so that you can get focus on the foreground. Some other things you might consider down the road are some light painting tools. I just got this brand new little panel light from Lume Cube that's about the same size as a cell phone, and it adjusts its color temperature from warm to cool and puts out 1600 lumens, which is a lot. And it's relatively soft because that's the way LED panels work. And then it has a diffuser to boot that you can click over it. Really nice, really small, much lighter than the panel lights I've been carrying out in the field for this effect. So a couple of those are great. The original Lume Cube is great if you want to light up something, distant. It throws a ton of light. There's a lot of light painting tools out there. I kind of like Lume Cube for going fast and light and carrying them in my pack. They don't add much weight to my pack, and they put out a lot of light. They're rechargeable and they last a long time. So headlamp and some accessories for lighting up that foreground a little bit. And you always want to do it softly. Another trick, if you're just getting started with light painting, a friend of mine taught me this one, is to actually, you put that white light on and you beam it off your hand and you actually reflect that headlamp. The headlamp's always in its white light going to be kind of blue daylight balanced, but if you bounce it off your hand is a warmer tone, and then it's reflecting off your hand back into the scene gently. So you can just kind of move your hand around and bounce that light into the scene. If you have a close foreground, try that out. It can actually work really well without getting that garish kind of light painted look. And that's a good way to get started with a headlamp. Although I warn you, if you start doing much light painting in your foreground, you're probably going to find yourself addicted in buying more sophisticated tools like the Lume Cube panel. So let's talk a little bit about getting your gear set up to actually capture the Milky Way. What are the settings and what are the considerations for focus and for exposure? And there's sort of two things to keep in mind for exposure. One is that exposure that you're going for, and the other is making sure that your exposure isn't too long so that those pinpoint stars start to trail and you start to get streaks instead of pinpoints. So talk about focus first, and we'll come back to that. I like to work with a prime lens if I can, and I actually just bought a lens that I absolutely love for doing Milky Way and stars. It's the Rokinon. We talked about it in gear a little bit, the 14 millimeter 2.4. They make that for Nikon and Canon. It's easily adapted for Sony and for the Nikon Z mount. I'm using the FTZ adapter here. It's a manual focus prime 14 millimeter lens. So it's fast, it's wide, so it gives me some more time. We'll talk about that in a second. But like all lenses, well, most lenses, some of Zeiss's and some Rokinons and some of the best quality, or not Rokinon, but some Voigtlanders and some of the absolute best quality lenses, if you turn it to infinity, it is absolutely an infinity. This lens, that was not the case. So I like to get on the tripod someplace in broad daylight with some distant feature like a mountain like this. And I'll zoom into live view to where I'm viewing a 100% view of my scene. I'm zoomed all the way in on some distant feature, and I'll focus it perfectly. And then I'll put a piece of gaff tape across between the barrel of the lens and the focusing ring so it can't move at all. And then I'll cut some strips of brightly colored gaff tape. Here I have a pink strip of gaff tape so that when I rotate my focusing ring, if that little pink triangle lines right up on the infinity mark, or on the focusing ring, boom, I know I'm at infinity. And I'm, a person who likes double redundancy. I have one on either side of the lens barrel, little strips, so that I know if I line up those 3 strips, or if one of those gets messed up, I still have 2 good ones. Because it's just really difficult in the dark to get that perfect infinity focus where the stars are in perfect focus. And it's really important to be able to nail that in the dark, because you might be photographing something with a foreground that's much closer and you need to focus on that. And the trick for that is using a light. If you're using, an LED panel light, I'm loving the new Lume Cube panel that just got released, or if you're using a Lume Cube, or if you're using a big panel light or some specialized light painting equipment, or even if you just have a good headlamp. I love these Princeton Tech Viz headlamps for a couple of reasons. One, if I triple click it, it locks so that I can't turn it on and off accidentally in the bag and burn its batteries out. I triple click it again, I can use it. One click turns on a red light, another click turns it off, click turns on a red light. I actually have to hold it down to get a white light. So that doesn't blow my night vision. A red headlamp in the dark when you're doing Milky Way stuff lets you actually see the back of your camera without blowing your night vision that you've been getting as it got dark. And you can, if you're shooting a close foreground subject, you can turn on the white light, shine it on that foreground, focus your camera on the foreground, take that first image with the foreground nice and focused, and then you can snap that infinity focus in to capture the Milky Way late at night when the Milky Way is out, and just combine those 2 images perfectly. So having that mark for infinity is really going to help. You can always light up the closer foreground and capture that focus that you need just through an artificial light, but you can't light up space and the things are way out at infinity from you to get that infinity focus. That's the one you want to mark. When it comes to exposure, I have a basic exposure that I use all the time for Milky Way. It doesn't matter what camera I'm using or anything else. And it was taught to me by this great National Geographic photographer mentor of mine, John Eastcott, who's done so many great Milky Ways. It's 3200 ISO, 30 seconds, f2.8. And you can adapt that. You can use the exposure triangle. Now, if that seems like something that's outside your wheelhouse, just go check out my scene to screen core course, because there's a whole section on the exposure triangle and on exposure. There's an entire bunch of videos about that. And that'll tell you everything that you need to know to adapt that. Let's say you have a lens that doesn't go down to f2.8. It only goes to f4. Well, you might need to use 6400 ISO. Now, the only complicating factor of this exposure is that if you leave your lens exposed, if you leave your camera open exposing for too long, you're not going to get pinpoint stars. You're going to get star trails. They're going to start turning into smeary lines because the Earth is revolving on its axis. So the way that you got to consider that, there's a 500 rule. And I'll put a little PDF out that has this exposure calculation and it has the 500 rule on it. The 500 rule states that for a full frame camera, like this Nikon Z7 that I have right here, you want to have no longer shutter speed than 500 divided by the focal length. So here I'm working with a 14 millimeter. That gives me about 34, 35 seconds that I can work with. I tend to limit it to 30 seconds. If I had a 50 millimeter lens, it would be 500 over 50. It would be 10 seconds. Now that calculation changes if you're using an APS-C or a Micro Four Third or a smaller sensor camera. It winds up being, for an APS-C, it's a 1.5 crop factor. So you say 500 over your focal length times 1.5, that focal length times 1.5. So for a 50 millimeter, it would be 500 over 75. You get the idea. If it's a Micro Four Thirds camera, that sensor is half the size of full frame. It's a 2 times crop factor, so it's 500 over your focal length times 2. So it would be 500, instead of 10 seconds that you get with a 50 millimeter lens on full frame, 500 over 50, you would wind up with 500 over 50 times 2, that's 500 over 100, that's 5 seconds. You have half the time before the stars start to smear because you're looking at a narrower window of the sky through your lens. So those are the exposure calculations and focus considerations to take into account. I think that you'll have a lot better time photographing the Milky Way if you pre-mark your lens for its infinity focus. If you're using a zoom lens, like for a long time I used the Nikon 14 to 24, I'm going to use it at 14 for the Milky Way because it gives me a longer exposure. With 14, again, I get 30 seconds. If I zoom into 24 millimeters, I drop myself down to 20 seconds. I'm limiting the amount of light I can bring in. So I just marked where the infinity focus is at 14 millimeters on the barrel of that lens. So those are some little tips, and then just keeping in mind that 500 rule when you're setting up and doing your exposure calculation. So I got Nathan, you guys know Nathan from Plus, with me here, and we just filmed that, and he's been like drinking beer and eating potato chips and directing, right? So, and he's like, what exactly is infinity? And what do you mean by find it and tape it? And it's a great question. It reminds me of kind of like my wife is often, she's a doctor and she'll come home and say really complex medical things. And I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? So what I really mean.
What is infinity?
Yeah, exactly.
How do I get my camera to infinity?
So infinity is just that focus that's way out there. You're doing your landscape. It's those mountains in the background. And the problem is that almost all lenses, with the exception of Voigtlander that I have and a Zeiss lens that I have, both of which are ripping expensive primes, they focus past it. And all autofocus lenses focus past it because they have to be able to zip to infinity and go past it and come back in order to not break when they hit the end of the travel on their fast autofocus motors. And so what happens is infinity will go back out of focus once you go past it. So you need to find that perfect point where the distant mountains and trees and the things at the very, very back of the scene are actually in focus. So that's what we're talking about. And I'll put a link to some little brightly colored gaffer's tape too. And what you're gonna do, you're gonna take some gaffer's tape and focus in, zoom into 100% on the back of your viewfinder at some mountain near your home or distant telephone pole, something way out in infinity from you, far, far away. You zoom into 100% so that you're zoomed way in on the subject on your live view. You focus it to where it's perfectly focused. Use your reading glasses if you need to. If you're mirrorless, use your diopter and look through and get it just razor sharp as you can. And then tape it so you can't move the focus ring at all. Just put a big swatch of tape on there. And then trim a really thin little slice of tape and put it across the focusing ring and the barrel of the lens, and then slice it with an X-Acto knife so that when you move the focus, when those two line up, you'll be in perfect focus and you can remove the gaff tape. And if you're like me, put 3 of them down. And that way, if one of them gets bumped or moved, you still have 2 to work with. All right.
Thank you. What if I don't have a prime lens? What if it's a telephoto lens?
Well, I talked about it. You're not going to use telephoto to photograph the Milky Way. But you might use a lens that zooms. And if we use a lens that zooms, I talked about that, you're probably going to want the widest setting. And it could shift where infinity focus is as you change zooms. Just do it at the widest because you want to use the widest so you get a longer exposure with that 500 rule.
Good people.
Good.
Thank you, man.
You got it. All right. All right. So the last thing I want to do out here in the field is talk about a few more advanced techniques that you can do when you're out photographing Milky Way. So one of them is if you find the foreground that you're really interested in, you've got the shot lined up, here there are some flowers and some logs that are interesting, and then we've got the mountain itself as kind of the midground, and then there's the background of the Milky Way. You can also do one where it's just the mountain is the foreground of the Milky Way. That's all going to be infinity. It's going to be easy to focus. But if you choose to include something like a log and flowers in the foreground, that's going to be a different focus distance. And because you're going to be using the widest aperture possible, you're not going to be able to get that in focus at the same time as the background. So that's why it's important to have that mark on your lens where you know where infinity is. So you can just snap to it and shoot the Milky Way all you want. And then you're going to use, your light painting gear. I got this Lume Cube panel or your headlamp to light up the foreground and find that focus in the foreground. Now, one technique to get that foreground and have a little bit of light on it and a clearer image of it is in this hour after the sun set, but before the Milky Way has risen. You're going to want to get that in focus, get it exposed, underexpose it maybe just a little bit. You can always pull it to look a little darker in post. You're going to shoot it at a lower ISO, a higher quality setting. You can use a little bit narrower aperture to get more in focus at once of that foreground. Then don't move your camera at all. Wait for the Milky Way to come out. Refocus to infinity and shoot that Milky Way in the background, and then just composite those two images together. Another way to do it is to shoot the Milky Way. Say it's late at night, you can only get one shot at that foreground focus and shoot it, when it's bright out. The other way to do it is to focus using your light painting gear and then softly light paint, whether you bounce your headlamp off your hand or you get some more sophisticated gear like this little Lume Cube panel and you softly paint the foreground at low intensity light, and while you're doing your 30-second exposure. It's going to be a little trial and error. You might want to paint it for just a couple of seconds. You might want to paint it for longer, depending on how far away your foreground is. You just play with sort of shifting the light around, using your hand to block part of the scene from getting light on it. It's a fun thing to play around with. Then refocus your lens, shoot the stars at infinity again. Some other advanced techniques, there's some software out there that'll let you take a whole bunch of Milky Way images exposed properly and analyze them for noise and get rid of the noise by comparing all the images and what's shifting in between each one. There's a great one from Matt called Starry Landscape Stacker that's just phenomenal. And so if you're going to think about using some software like that, just set up in one spot and shoot a whole bunch of frames. Shoot your focused foreground if you have a close foreground that's lit a little bit. Then just shoot maybe 20 Milky Way images properly exposed, and you'll be able to feed those in and you'll be blown away with how it gets rid of the noise. It averages them all and gets rid of the noise. So just, again, like 20 shots. It's going to take a while. I would set up with an intervalometer maybe and just put a 1 second gap between each image. Turn your noise reduction completely off, your long exposure noise reduction. Otherwise, you're going to want to use long exposure noise reduction. It's going to get a little bit cleaner image while you're just photographing a single frame. But if you're doing that averaging thing, turn that off. The final thing that I'd talk about is kind of an advanced technique. It involves getting one of these star trackers. This is an Ioptron star tracker, and what it does is you set it up and you focus it on the points, the North Star. It has a little illuminated focusing thing inside where you can actually line this up where it's pointed right at the North Star, and then you set your tripod head up on it, and it's going to revolve with the Earth. It's going to just revolve the same revolution that the Earth's doing as it's turning on its axis. It's going to mimic that and keep the stars fixed in space. There are different settings on it. One's for the moon, one's for the sun, one is just for the Earth's rotation. And you're going to have a blurred foreground. This is more of the shot for just shooting the mountain without a foreground in it. But as it tracks the stars, it'll let you get a longer exposure and get around that 500 rule that we talked about a little bit earlier. And I don't have a whole bunch of time in post-production to go into the starry stacker, but we might take a look at an image from this and see how it turns out. This is actually my first go-round with one of these, and I'm really excited to try it out tonight.
All right, so I'm back in the studio, and I've got my images here in PhotoRaw 2019. It's looking really good. All right, but let's get a little fancier with it, and let's do a little bit of compositing. So I'm going to click to add a new layer, and the layer I want to work on is this one of the mountain. So I'm going to double click that. It's going to take it a second. It's throwing another raw file in layered on top of this one, and then I want to go into the transform tool. I'm going to hold down shift. Holding down shift is going to kind of lock my perspective so I don't warp the mountain Still holding down shift, grabbing the corners. And I'm probably going to stop a little short of actually clipping that. And then what I want to do, I'm going to jump into develop. I want to mask out the sky in this image. And it's going to get a lot easier to do if I boost exposure in that particular image and I bump up contrast and I blow out the whites even more and maybe pull the midtones darker and the shadows darker and highlights. Highlights can get blown up. I'm really trying to get a nice hard edge between the mountain and the sky. I'm going to close this panel so I can really see what I'm doing and enlarge the image a little bit. I'm going to hit Control plus, Command plus for the Mac, and I'm going to hold down the space bar to get my hand tool. I'm going to close this panel as well. Everyone's like, what are you doing right now? Well, I'm getting a nice big view of the image, and then what I want to do is I'm going to grab my masking brush and I want to paint out, and I want a 0 feather, 100% opacity. I'm just going to drop this down a little bit. I'm going to turn on the perfect brush and I want to just paint this edge right on out. Multiple brush strokes. I also still feel like messing around with the color temperature of the one below. This is just this game where you play lots of little moves. Maybe come back towards green just a little from magenta. Still feel like it's got too much magenta in it. There we go. And then with this foreground bit, I really want to just go ahead and I'm going to pull the black slider down just a little, just a touch. White slider can come up for a little bit more contrast in that foreground. Shadows can come up just a smidge. You know, this is all lit with that Lume Cube. I don't want to overdo it and make it seem unnatural. Midtones can come up just a smidge. And then I think overall maybe just the whole thing a touch darker, so we bring the whole thing back just a little bit. Contrast. Man, I'm not going to mess with contrast very much at all. Again, you know, I think big dramatic moves. Blue is way blue. Warm is too warm. I think he probably was lit just about right. I think I chose kind of a less than tungsten white balance, but pretty warm. Saturation, we could go a little more, a little less. I'd say just about like that. And then, you know, one more go round because we have that middle ground, the mountain in between. You know, we might pull the shadows down just a smidge more, just make it even more subtle there in the background. And the black's even a little darker. There you go. So to me, I think that that we've got a pretty darn good. I might brighten up the whole underlying Milky Way image. Oh, I've got the wrong one. Hold on, let me undo that. Might brighten up the whole underlying Milky Way image just a little bit. Just bring up the sky just a touch to kind of blend it into the rest. Boom. There you go. So,
all right, and so if you want to know more about Photo Raw, deep dive, look under the hood, see all the bit that I cut out of the post-production portion of that video. There's about, I don't know, 25 more minutes of it. Just go to the link that I'm placing in the video description. If you're on mobile, click the video title and it'll show you the description. If you're on the web, if you're on a desktop or laptop, just click Show More and it'll give you links to all the products that I use, as well as a link into the whole complete video. One's got that up for free for everyone because of the Mount Saint Helens anniversary. All right, thanks so much to everyone. I hope to see you in office hours this Tuesday. I hope you'll upload an image to our light challenge and cruise through that gallery and be there, and I get to see your face on Tuesday. I really hope so. And thanks so much. We'll see you next week.